community college, and how do we bring that across the board?
Well, I'm in the School of Education, and actually when I meet with professors across campus, especially those in the at class, the College of Liberal Arts and Science, they're shocked with the student population I have. Now, I'll be honest, I have a lot of students here. What race were the majority of your teachers? Come on, shout it out, you know it. Right. I grew up in South LA and East LA. They were still white, you know? So I get that kind of population, and because the School of Education is predominantly a graduate institution, we do get predominantly white, straight, middle class, upper class females. So I see that diversity, I see the racial divide not only happening between the universities, right? I also see it happening between the levels of education, whether it's undergrad to graduate school and by field. And I ask my teacher candidates, is what we call them, they're my white teacher candidates. I say, why don't you think we have teacher candidates of color? And often they say, well, it's probably because they don't, they couldn't find someone qualified, that rhetoric. Or they're probably not interested in this path, or maybe they couldn't make it to this, there's all this really dominant rhetoric that goes around. But it comes down, as a student of color, myself, growing up in LA, I said no, because I've had a white teacher who denigrated my racial identity to a point where I never wanted to go anything close to education. Am I right on some of that? Have you? I see nodding heads. You're kind of scared to say an amen. But that's why we're changing the landscape of education. We're hoping that more teachers of color join the workforce, and that those white teachers that get into the program not only learn about the cultures of the student, but learn about their own whiteness and how it impacts how they deliver culturally and multicultural education.
I've been here 30 years. And I don't like what I've seen. I don't like what I see now. I want to give a shout out to Strike Debt. Because that's what we need. More Strike Debt. More Jeff Coes. Ethnic studies didn't start by people going to an administrator and asking permission. You see, what I was talking about in terms of racial cartels, it operates on people of color too. Because, just like Alex was saying, we got an African American mayor and chief of police and manager of safety. But there's this process known as colonialist amnesia, where people integrate what's expected of them from these cartels that I was talking about. It's a buy-in. Just like Cheryl was talking about, the social construction of whiteness. Not all people who are considered white today were always considered to be white. Italians, Irish, Jews, at one time they were considered white people. Really? Well, how did that change? They had to buy in. They had to buy into the ideology of white supremacy. And that's happening with people of color too. And so the difference between CCD and Metro and UCD, I think, is that. I'm tenured. I can say whatever I want. And this administration at UCD, they pay lip service to diversity. And then they put people in positions to hire people of color who have already bought in. So they're not going to hire people who rock the boat. I'm on my way out, man, and they are so glad. But we need younger people to remind them that we're not in a post-racial society. That those same inequalities that inspired people to demand ethnic studies in the 60s and 70s, that demanded greater hiring goals and affirmative action in the 60s and 70s, that needs to happen again, because we're losing it. And even the people of color that they're hiring, are softening it, because they need to get tenure. And they need to be pushed. People in power need to be pushed. You know that quote by Frederick Douglass? Power concedes nothing without a demand. Nothing. It never has, it never will. So the struggle may be moral or it may be physical, but there must be struggle. There is no change without struggle. And you're not here because of your individual action. People fought for you to be here. People died for you to be here. They fought for me to be here. And we can't forget that. And the fact that there are more people of color at CCD and Metro is exactly this cartel system in operation. The internalization of that oppression. Convincing, I know, I deal with it in the Indian community all the time. I talk to young Native students over at CCD or at Metro, say, why aren't you at UCD? Come on over to UCD. Oh, I'm not smart enough. Oh, that's, I won't fit in over there. We have to break down those bonds of internalized oppression. And so it's all of our responsibilities. So that's it.
From a personal standpoint, as a student, I went through the process of going to CCD. I didn't graduate from CCD, but I finally gathered enough credits to transfer to UCD. When I originally graduated high school, I didn't have enough credits, or at least that's what I was told, to go. I didn't have enough credits for Metro. My GPA from high school wasn't high enough for Metro. It wasn't high enough for UCD. So I had to start with a community college. But I think you can also trace the deterrence and the lack of communication between the campuses. I started an NAACP chapter on campus, I guess it's been about a year ago, and my entire faculty board had to be UCD students, which was already a deterrent, or it was harder for me to reach out to Metro students. It was harder for me to reach out to CCD students, to include them, at least on a board level, where they could make decisions for the organization, unless they were UCD. So I think that when you examine the deterrents, unfortunately, it's been successful. It makes it a lot harder for folks of color to come from underfunded educational settings in their communities and then work through all of the processes to get to higher education. Not to say it's impossible and people don't do it on a daily basis, but it's a lot more difficult. And I think we've touched on it a lot today in regards to the disproportion and the disparities in these communities, and these carry into the schools. Did you want to add to that? But I think that, as a student, for me coming from CCD and going to UCD, coming from high school, there were a couple other students of color who graduated with me, and they came to Metro to play sports. They got scholarships for sports. I was unable to attend UCD. I was unable to attend Metro, but I think that just examining the amount of deterrents has made it real difficult for students of color to engage from CCD into UCD. I mean, social justice just recently became a minor on the campus, and hopefully one day it'll be a major. But I think that, you know, as far as progression, increasing tuition rates, however you want to look at it, there are disparities, and it makes it difficult for students of color to rise through that program.
I'm sorry, I just wanted to say one last thing about this campus. I was here when this campus started. This was a revolutionary concept that's been squandered. To have a community college and a state college and a state university on the same campus, there was an opportunity to break down class barriers and race barriers and gender barriers on this campus. And there still is. But you students have to overcome the administrations because they've corporatized higher education. And when you corporatize an institution, then collaboration is not an option. There has to be the UCD building. And now they're talking about a UCD just rec building. You know, sports building. Over on the playing fields, right over there, they're talking about it. Just for UCD students now. Those lowly CCD students, they can't come in. Those Metro students, they gotta go somewhere else. And Metro does the same thing. They become imperialists in their own way, grabbing this building or that building. And it betrays the vision that was originally this campus, which was to bring people from all different communities, from all different economic classes together on this campus, to have that interchange, to have that richness of collaborative effort. And to make it clear to those people at community college, there was a place for them in a university, that they could work their way over in case they got this inferior education in their public school system. We need to reclaim that. You need to reclaim that. You need to make this campus a revolutionary idea again. It's possible, but you have to overcome the inertia in those 14, 15 floor offices over there. So I just encourage you to do that, to remember what the vision of this place was. And I know that this campus was built on white supremacy too. You know, it evacuated communities of color to build this campus. And we can try to remedy that. It's still possible. But it's up to you to do it.
We have a question back there.
Yeah, my name is Sheikh, and before I get to my question, I have a comment to make. When she was talking about emotional whiteness, and he was talking about the cartel, there is actually a link. It's the emotional feeling that white supremacy feels is taught to people of color through systematic rhetorical ways. One big example that will shock anybody whenever I talk about it is when people say majority rules, democracy. I agree to it, it's fine. But when you say majority rules in America, who's majority in America? Exactly. So we are taught to accept white supremacy in slower ways. That's why when you go into Congress, the majority is white because majority rules. So that's how the emotional feeling that they have is taught to us, and we accept those cartels, which makes our institutions more white-like. So the institutions are racially based. Just like you were saying, Metro and UCD, they imperialize themselves through the people. It's the same system. So with that said, how do we process into condemning those teachings? Because like Malcolm X said one time, before you ask to be taught something, ask yourself who taught you what you know. That was my question and my comment. Thank you.
Are we going to pass on that?
I agree with you 100%. I think that, this is the idea of assimilation, and you can see it demonstrated in many fashions, from the places we shop, from our subdivisions, which we consider our communities. It's all a structure and the overall normative, which, like you said, is normative white America. I think you see it everywhere you look if you pay close enough attention to some degree. I really honestly don't feel like there's much response needed. I think that was actually a very enlightening piece to the subject matter.
The systems that are set up are white supremacist in nature. So regardless to the presence of white people, it'll manifest and it'll do proper routines and manifestations that uphold a white supremacist culture. It's kind of like saying, for women, if men are not in the room, does patriarchy exist? Hell yeah, still does. So it's the same thing with whites. I think how you can see a white supremacist system set up is in the state of California. The word majority and minority is something I grew up in the 80s and 90s, and a little bit of the 70s. But when the 90s hit and people of color made the majority, the actual numerical majority, Congress and the state Senate already banished that word from all public documents. So we couldn't call ourselves the majority in California when I was the majority. In fact, I find it very pejorative, having now moved, living in LA and New York and coming to Colorado, and someone calling me a minority. I ain't no minority. I'm California, you see me all around. But that is just one example of how you know that regardless to the numbers of those in a dominant position, there's already dominant structures set up to manifest itself.
Okay, before we take the third question, let me take three more. And I saw a hand up. 1, 2, 3, and on reserve. If you can remember your numbers. Okay, our third question.
Hi, my name is Isaac Rivera. I'm a geographer in the graduate school. I really appreciate all the maps that you placed, Professor Morris, a lot. But I also wanted to add maybe another word that I think is important that has helped kind of legitimize this discourse, development, developing qua capitalism, development as progress, and how through these mappings has physically displaced these people. I think that the racial cartels is a very useful term to place the racial segregation from this discourse of development. So my question for you, Professor Morris, would the law school professor that came up with this term, would she give nod to this discourse of development with a capital D, and it's basically new imperialism. It's these new apartheid that is happening within communities today.
What's your first name?
My name's Isaac.
Isaac.
I want to thank you for raising that, and I want to connect it with the brother. What was your name? Check. Your comment about semantics, the use of semantics and the use of semiotics. Some of you, the study of semiotics, the study of the meaning of signs or symbols. And development is one of those terms that's really loaded, and it also causes communities of color sometimes to internalize standards or models of behavior about what's successful, what constitutes success. It's another loaded term. So development, and so Chad reminded me. I kind of ran out of time. I know it's difficult for you to believe, but when I was making my presentation about redlining in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and the consequences of that today, because those communities were blocked out of financing. And then in the Carter administration, they passed actually a very progressive piece of legislation on one hand called the Community Reinvestment Act, which encouraged banks to provide financing for exactly those communities that had been aced out. But then, with the Bush administrations, both father and son administrations, that legislation was replaced by other legislation that unleashed the banks to do the criminality that caused the collapse of the economy and the home mortgage crisis. Well, it was in that home mortgage crisis that then these criminal banks began to, in the name of development, began to loan all this money into these formerly redlined communities, knowing that those debtors couldn't pay back their mortgages. And so the consequence of that was that the wealth in Black and Latino communities in particular was devastating. And so any home equity that was gained through the Community Reinvestment Act under the Carter administration was lost and more. 50% more in the Black community and 65% more in the Latino community. So you actually, lost a lot of ground. But that's because of part of these development strategies that you're talking about. And I do want to encourage you, Isaac, to engage in this kind of progressive cartography, because cartography, historically, as you know, as a geography student, has been used as an oppressive tool, often to demarcate or define territory, define space in ways that are consistent with the white supremacist narrative. And so for you as a man of color to be able to take those tools now and to make visible the methods in which white supremacy has oppressed communities of color, I think is a very strong liberatory act. So I encourage you to do that. I hope that was responsive to your question.
Before we take the next question, I just want to indicate two organizations. Glenn mentioned one of them. One of them is Strike Debt, the national organization that is fighting debt. Their latest jubilee was to buy up student debt and then abolish it. That is a mechanism of control and discipline, and people are organizing around that issue. And secondly, there's folks in this room that are involved in the Colorado Foreclosure Resistance Coalition, which is a community group here in Denver, Colorado, that fights, there you are. They're good people, and they fight to keep people in their homes. They're important, they need your support. You can see a couple of the folks over here put their hand up. Can you put your hands up again if you're, yeah, so over there, if you want to talk to folks about it, please do. So there are organizations that are working on these issues, fighting. Right. Okay, so our next question.
Hi, my name is Andrea. I go here to CCD, studying to be a paralegal. I just want to say how much you've really deeply touched me today and opened up my mind. My question is for Alex. I just want to know if you can briefly go over your process of what you did to have a successful outcome in winning your case against the police department.
I began, actually, it started that night when I decided to take photos, or to have somebody take photos. If you ever have any negative interactions with law enforcement, documentation is key. Write down exactly what you remember immediately, or at your first opportunity. When I was finally able to do that, they kept me in a separate cell, an isolated cell, before they put me in with the cellmate and the rest of the general population. I had 45 stitches in my face, a broken nose, and concussion, so they wanted to monitor my vitals. But had I told them, and I almost did, I almost told the ambulance to leave. Honestly, the first thing that went through my mind was, I don't have insurance. I don't know if I'm going to be able to pay for an ambulance ride. Get out of here. Had I done that, that would have cost me my life. And I think that step one is making the decision to have photos taken. And then moving from there, I had a detective who came to visit me while I was in jail. And he was trying to get me to give him a statement about what happened. I hadn't spoken with any sort of legal representation at the time. So I told him, no, I'm not going to talk to you until I speak with some sort of representation, an attorney, a public defender, somebody who's here on my behalf. So eventually he left. And at that point, I was falsely charged with criminal intent to disarm a peace officer. That was their excuse for using the amount of force they did, which is another pattern and practice of law enforcement. There was a moment even in the Ferguson case where Michael Brown allegedly tried to disarm the officer. And as long as an officer's life is allegedly in danger, any force is necessary, any force is acceptable. Homicide, excessive shooting, excessive beating, it's all acceptable. As community members, we know otherwise. I feel like after I was released from jail, and I only spent about 4 days in there, but I went immediately to Internal Affairs, which was on the same block. It's on the 13th Cherokee block. At this time, we didn't know, this didn't surface until 2010, but until an investigation was done by Mohammed Bai firm, which is a civil firm, who was representing 5 women who were beat up by the same officer as myself 6 months later. We found out that Internal Affairs was totally staffed by officers that were already under investigation for patterns and practices of police abuse. They were at their desk jobs. So when I went into Internal Affairs and told them what happened to me, I'm sitting there with 45 stitches in my face, 19 years old. My right eye swollen shut, my capillaries in my left eye are broken, my face is totally bruised. She tells me, I've been telling her what happened, and she says, sometimes it's not always a good idea, and sometimes you need to own up to your actions as a man, and it's not always a good idea to play the race card. So that was her response to my alleged complaint of race-based hatred and violence. This is part of what we've been talking about, right? Don't not acknowledge it because it's a charged topic or it's bad for PR. It doesn't make the problem go away. But afterwards, after she told me that, I totally shut down with Internal Affairs. I told her, you obviously don't have my best interest at heart. We're done talking, basically. She got onto some rant about how if I had gone for her gun, she would have blown me away. She would have used any means necessary to take my life away. So it speaks to the mentality of, and I don't even want to say all the officers, but the officers that I have encountered in Denver Police and a good majority of the community have encountered. Even city officials will tell you, don't make any sudden movements around police. They will shoot you. Why is that an acceptable practice? After that point, I went, and I did all this with a public defender. I had the district attorney give me one deal. He said he would lower my charge to assault on an officer. It would have reduced it from a felony to a misdemeanor, meaning I wouldn't have gone to prison, but I would have had to go to the county jail. When you're innocent, you don't take a plea bargain. And that, unfortunately, is part of the makeup. If you trump the charge up high enough and you give them no wiggle room, it's either maximum conviction or dismissal. And at that point in my life, I really didn't care. So, I figured, I'm going to ride this all the way through. I'm going to take this to trial. And then one day I got a phone call. This was the day after our motions. We filed motions to suppress and stop. They said it was an illegal left turn. And we went over and took photos of the intersection. There was no sign that prohibited a left turn. Then all of a sudden, the officers who contacted me wanted to say I made a turn coming from Downey. So things got confused with the transcripts. And I don't know exactly when this surfaced, but another officer, the officer who I allegedly tried to disarm, said that she was never assaulted by Mr. Landau. Mr. Landau never went for my gun. And there were 5 other officers who were stating in written statements that they saw me reach for her pistol, that they had to secure her pistol, before the altercation continued. So, they couldn't be represented by the same attorneys, and that was crucial. After I wrote out my narrative, you have to make sure you have your narrative. You don't want to bring things up later that might have happened because they'll attack you at every point possible. They will scrutinize everything you've written down. And officers obviously have, which is a total systemic flaw, far more immunity than you and I do as community members. Afterwards, my case was eventually dismissed out of nowhere. My motions were denied. I got a phone call from my public defender, and he said that my charges had all been dropped. If I had any questions, to give him a call. So I called him and I asked him, so my case is dismissed, we're done. He said, we're done, you know, and he said, now you can pursue civil representations if you'd like. One thing I found out is if you take a plea bargain, you're admitting to some sort of guilt, so there wouldn't have been an opportunity for civil repercussions. So had I taken assault on an officer as a plea, I would have been able to sue the city. I would have been able to look for civil representation because you're admitting to some sort of guilt. So if you're innocent, from my personal experience, I would stick to what you know. And that's the truth. And from there, I thought it would be real easy to get, civil representation. I've got these grotesque photos. I've got this narrative that doesn't add up. My case was dismissed. I probably spoke to almost every civil attorney in Colorado. I couldn't even tell you how many I spoke to. More than 30. I was even calling civil attorneys out of state. Sitting down, meeting with them, getting denied. Sitting down, meeting with them, getting denied. Paying retainer fees for investigations that I knew weren't going to help me, and then find no findings. I went and canvassed the area myself. I knew there was no investigation that could be done with witnesses. That was another thing I did. When I got out, I wouldn't look for witnesses. I looked for street cameras. I looked for any potential recording device that could videotape what happened. 16th and Emerson, where I was pulled over, unfortunately, is a gentrified neighborhood in Capitol Hill that is now mostly law practice offices, very nice multi-million-dollar condos. Nobody was really out at 1 in the morning. And then from there, moving forward, there was a time when I was discouraged to the point where I was like, at least I have my life. I'm here. I'm not dead. I'm on campus. And one of my professors told me, she's like, Yvonne Fry, actually, she used to teach her. Rest in peace. She told me that, this isn't right. You need to pursue this. You need to pursue justice. Those weren't her exact words, but then, I printed off a list of civil attorneys from the computer lab and just started crossing them off, calling them and crossing them off. And I found the Holland Edwards and Roseman firm on 14th and High. And after reviewing my case, and I knew what it was. I knew attorneys weren't really reading the details. To them, I was another 19-year-old black male that allegedly tried to disarm police and was beaten almost to death because of it. That was the narrative. When I got a call back from Anna Holland, was the person who called me, she said, you need to get in here. We need to sit down with you. And then, they went through page by page. Clearly, the officer's testimony did not match up. Clearly, my witness was arrested for a small amount of weed. He was coerced for a false statement and then released with no charges. So, they said basically you're going to write, you're going to say what we tell you to say, or we're going to charge you with what we charged you frankly. They were telling him all kinds of racial-based things in the police station, but that was the process. And then once you found the right civil attorney, is going from there. But it's a very complex system. Nobody taught me how to do that in high school. Nobody's taught me how to do that on college. Nobody, that's one of the reasons why I do know your rights trainings, because I don't have a class. I never had a class on the best way and the most appropriate way to interact with law enforcement.
Thank you. I just want to remind you that some of that literature from Alex is over here at this table. So even if you think it's not going to be useful for you, please take it if you know anyone that could use Know Your Rights training and the hotline number for racial profiling. So please take that. So we have our second question here.
Hi, my name is Noel Montoya. I'm a second-year doc student at UC Denver. Dr. Sherwin T.S. is my advisor. My question is for you, Alex, and it's, if you haven't heard Alex's story on NPR, I highly encourage you just to go on there and listen to it. It's quite fascinating. When I first heard it, it was quite emotional for me. And one of the questions that I had, though, now in hindsight, do you think that there should be mechanisms in place for white parents adopting people of color to help them, to help the white parents understand how to raise a person of color? Because I think one of the things that stood out to me is that my whole life changed at that moment. I think your mother said that, my whole worldview or something along those lines changed at that moment, and I thought, well, it should have changed the moment you adopted a black young man. And I just wonder, like, how many people of color you see that are infants with white people, whether they're Asian, whether they're black, whether they're Latino, and I worry for those young kids. So I just wonder what your perspective is on that now, in hindsight.
Certainly, no, it's actually, I'm glad you said that. You brought up a whole other realm of work that I'm involved in. I attend heritage camps. In the heritage program, they have multiple camps. They have domestic adoption, Chinese heritage camp, African Caribbean heritage camp, Indian heritage camp. They have a number of different camps, and I do seminars there with, and you know, the reality is the predominant ethnicity that's adopting are white people. So, you know, when I'm doing a workshop, these are things that I talk about. I talk about how uneducated my parents were to the realities of the possibilities of being a black person in this day and age, in just this world in general. We do know your rights trainings, but I definitely encourage parents, if you have adopted a child of color from anywhere, you know, of another ethnicity, you have to do your diligence. You can't just read a book about adoption and think that, oh, now I'm an expert. You have to have the true cultural understanding, and I think that is actually that's become a big part of the work that I do, is the way that it's affected my mom and my dad. So I do go down there every summer, and it's several months of just camp after camp. They do them at the South Campus for CCD on Federal in Dartmouth. They also do them at the YMCA up in Estes Park, and there's another location as well. But they are very informative. We usually do get a pretty good turnout, and the parents are very responsive. These are things that I can tell they're eager to learn. Any parent who has a love for their child, well, not to say all parents, but a good majority of the parents I come in contact with who have a love for their child are open and responsive to the information. Yes.
I think we're going to run out of time, and people are going to have to leave in a little while. So, Chad, I'd like to take the liberty of kind of segueing from that question to address a larger question that often is lurking in audiences like this or events like this. And unfortunately, you know, a number of people already had to leave, but you know, we've talked about a lot of macro issues here. And like, so what are we to do, you know, as Lenin would say, what is to be done here? You know? How do we address the underlying structural problems or institutional problems that caused Michael Brown to be killed? And one of the things that is related to that last question is, you know, my mother was not Native. My mother was Irish Catholic. Her family was from Tipperary County, Ireland. And all of her life she refused to be called white, because she said, that's not my word. That's not our word. That's somebody else made that up. White is a color. I'm Irish. And when you call me white, you deny me my entire identity. I come from a people with a culture and a language and a history, and I'm not going to have that stolen from me. And that's part of the liberation for people who are called white by a system of white supremacy. That's a social construction that's been imposed upon people. And I quote the author Noel Ignatieff, who wrote a book called How the Irish Became White. And he has a journal, I don't think he still publishes it, but he had a journal for several years called Race Trader. And what he means by that is, for people who are European American heritage, reclaim your humanity. Reclaim your humanity and resist this ideological construct that's been imposed and forced upon you. It's like my mother did. And she said, and I'm not accepting the kinds of things that they tell me I have to accept. Her relatives rode with John Brown in eastern Kansas. You know who John Brown is. Abolitionist. You know? So they came from a revolutionary past. My relatives on her side were hanged for resisting British imperialism in Ireland. Now, they come from a history of resistance. And she wasn't going to accept this other form of oppression that was being forced upon her. And so if we're going to change this country, and the whole civil rights movement is populated with people who were race traitors, including, people like Earl Warren. I know that's hard to believe for those of you who know Earl Warren's history, but the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court in Brown versus Board of Education, or James Easterbrook on the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, people who stood up and said, I might look white in the parlance of the popular culture, but I'm going to betray my privilege. And I'm going to do something actively to reverse this process of privilege that I have. And that's incumbent upon all of us, whether we're white or look white or European American or mixed race or we're light-skinned people of color. We have a responsibility to use that privilege to defeat this oppression. And I just want to say that, kind of in wrapping this up, that it begins at the micro. I mean, there are multiple levels at which this struggle happens. And so when we talk about home mortgage crises or, people, oh my God, what am I going to do about that? Maybe you can't do anything about that in your immediate life, but you can make a decision for yourself about whether you're going to continue to participate in a system of oppression. That's within all of our power. Thanks.
We're going to end with that. So, another round of applause for everyone who came out, for our speakers. Some of us can stick around for more dialogue and discussion. Please take literature. Please share it with others. Thanks again for everyone that made this possible.
Let's give Chad a round of applause for organizing.